Hi there. I'm Lee Nida, the Standards Implementation Supervisor with the Minnesota Department of Education.
And I'm Chris Bretz, Campus Literacy Specialist with the Minnesota Department of Education.
Hi, I'm Victoria Muka, English Language Arts Specialist in Standards Implementation with the Minnesota Department of Education.
And I'm Jake Senchins, Education Services Director at the Northwest Service Cooperative, one of the Minnesota Service Cooperatives.
This webinar is part of a series of recorded webinars designed to support teachers and school leaders in the implementation of the 2020 ELA standards with full implementation in the 2025-26 school year. We'll be releasing these webinars in sets, yet we hope that you will use them as they align to your school's needs. Evidence-based practices are highlighted in many of these. The Minnesota Department of Education is committed to equity. The 2020 ELA standards represent a prioritization of equity and aim to improve equitable conditions for learning for all students. We also believe that these implementation support webinars will help us ensure consistent implementation of the 2020 standards fully in the 2025-26 school year. The Evidence-Based Practices webinar will highlight Commitment 6, Start Early in an Explicit Instruction of Foundational Reading Skills and Reading Comprehension, as well as starting early in the practice of writing every day. We will also highlight Commitment 10, Giving Students Options in Self-Selection for Engagement. Today, our topics will include explicit instruction, both the foundational skills of phonics, instruction, and reading comprehension, self-selection for engagement, and writing every day for a variety of purposes. The updates to the 2020 Minnesota ELA standards are underpinned by evidence, largely the What Works Clearinghouse's IES practice guides. This includes both literacy and more general best practices in education. What Works Clearinghouse has a high threshold for research studies that limits the number of educational research studies that are included. The IES practice guide starts with studies that meet the high research threshold and then examine the level of evidence that exists across studies to support an instructional practice.
In this webinar, we're referencing Anita Archer's 16 elements of explicit instruction as one of several example available models of explicit instruction. Here we list the 16 elements, highlighting important qualities of each element. To quote Archer, explicit instruction is characterized by a series of supports or scaffolds whereby students are guided through the learning process. During explicit instruction, the teacher assumes a very high level of responsibility to make sure new learning is clearly understood by students and carefully guides student practice using a gradual release of responsibility. Individual lessons will vary in terms of which elements are used, but over time, all 16 elements are essential to effective instruction. We invite viewers of this webinar to pause the presentation to briefly review Archer's elements, taking note of highlighted terms which emphasize important instructional qualities. In addition, Archer's 16 elements can be considered within an overall approach that includes both instructional design and instructional delivery. Highly effective instruction begins with careful instructional design. The teacher must clearly understand critical content and should think carefully about how instruction can be logically presented to students in digestible, highly comprehensible steps. The teacher must then deliver instruction that incorporates various supports that promote student success, including intentionally planned checks for understanding to ensure students are getting it. As you view the webinar, we'll present evidence-based practices that incorporate many of the elements of explicit instruction presented here.
Let's look at an established routine using sound boxes from a first grade lesson. Routines get quicker with time when students and teachers are familiar, but repeating the clear instructions is good practice. This explicit instruction is focused on one of the foundational benchmarks in the 2020 ELA standards, 1.1.1.2 and 1.1.1.3. Typically, when working with the foundational skills in younger grades, we keep the instruction focused on the specific content that is critical for students to master. The teacher might start by saying, we're going to use our sound boxes to write the sounds we hear in the word pig. Remember, each box gets one sound. What is the first sound you hear in pig? The students would hopefully identify the p sound. The teacher would say, let's write the p sound in the first box. What is the last sound you hear in pig? The students would identify the g sound. The teacher would say, let's write the g sound in the last box. What sound do you hear in the middle of the word pig? The students would then say the I sound. Let's write the I sound in the middle box. Now we have all the sounds in the word pig. In the word pig, the first letter, P, is a consonant. The second letter, I, is a vowel. And the third letter, G, is a consonant. This is a CVC pattern word, and it means that the vowel sound in the middle will be short. Once the explicit instruction portion is finished, the teacher then moves the students into a gradual release of responsibility, moving toward independent practice in identifying the sounds in CVC words. In this instance, students would practice manipulating short I CVC words by moving letter tiles within the sound boxes and creating short I CVC words. Students would be asked to change the initial and ending sounds, keeping the short vowel sound constant. Teachers would start by guiding the students through examples of which letter to change, then have students create different short I words using their letter tiles independently. In the 2020 ELA standards, phonics is no longer limited to early elementary, but follows a progression to the 6th grade. At this level, the explicit phonics teaching emphasizes morphology, the meaning of parts of words, including prefixes, suffixes, and root words. This teaching can be used by students to determine the meaning of more complex multisyllable words and aid in vocabulary acquisition. Morphology lessons like the following are good to incorporate with the teaching of vocabulary before reading. In this example of explicit instruction, the teacher might say something like, in order to understand the meaning of words, we need to know the meanings of chunks and how words are made with those meaningful chunks. In this word ladder, the word contains the root photo, which means light. So if I know that photo means light, what would photograph mean? In this case, it would literally mean light drawing or drawing made of light. The teacher could then ask the students, what would the word photocopy mean? What about the word photosynthesis? Providing other example words that use the same root. Moving toward the gradual release of responsibility and independent practice, the students would then practice manipulating these words by creating new words from their choice of word chunks. They would then record the meaning next to each of the created words. This routine could also be used across content areas to teach specialized vocabulary, helping students to generalize the meaning of word parts across different contexts. This is where the standards can be bundled not only across the ELA standards, but also with other content areas.
Now let's look at some evidence-based practices supporting comprehension. These practices are drawn from the Institute of Education Sciences Practice Guide entitled Improving Reading Comprehension in Kindergarten through 3rd Grade. This guide presents 5 core practices that support reading comprehension in the early elementary grades. The practices include explicitly teaching reading comprehension strategies, teaching the organizational structures of text to students, leading focused, high-quality conversations about texts in the classroom, carefully selecting texts that support comprehension instruction, and designing lessons to be highly engaging and motivating for students. Note these practices are curriculum neutral and can be integrated with existing resources to strengthen instruction. Today, we'll share an instructional example for recommendation number 2, teach students to identify and use the text organizational structure to comprehend, learn, and remember content. In this 3rd grade comprehension example, we consider the teaching of text structure, which aligns to Anchor Standard R5, shown in the green box to the left. A bundle of aligned 3rd grade benchmarks is listed below Anchor Standard R5 as one example of how text structure can incorporate a number of subcomponents. The table to the right presents instructional guidance for 5 common text structures: description, sequence, problem solution, cause-effect, and compare-contrast. The table details how the topic of hurricanes can be presented using each of these structures. As highlighted in the red box, aligned classroom activities are suggested for each type of structure. For example, when using the text structure sequence, the teacher might create cards with the steps that lead to hurricane formation and have students arrange themselves in a line that orders these steps accurately. When teaching cause and effect, a teacher might have students match the causes of a hurricane with their corresponding effects in a game-like activity. These sample activities provide representative ways text structure can be taught explicitly in a third grade classroom. In our next example, we consider evidence-based practices supporting comprehension in ninth grade. Again, we're highlighting practices detailed in an IES practice guide entitled Improving Adolescent Literacy, Effective Classroom and Intervention Practices. The recommended practices at this level include providing explicit vocabulary instruction, providing direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction, facilitating classroom discussion to extend students' understanding of texts, incorporating strategies to increase student motivation and engagement, and providing reading interventions delivered by appropriately licensed specialists for students in need of additional support. As in our third grade example, strategies presented here are curriculum neutral and are supported by sound educational research. In this example, we'll focus on recommendation number 2, provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. This example presents the use of an interactive reading guide for a ninth grade informational text. The selected anchor standard addresses reading comprehension of complex literary and informational texts. An aligned bundle of benchmarks is listed below the anchor standard. Interactive reading guides can be used to provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. Steps for designing effective guides are shown in the center of the slide. Teachers preview the reading assignment, construct a step-by-step guide that provides directions and prompts for students, and determine how each segment of the text will be processed. A lesson sample is provided on the right for an informational text about water clarity and sediments. Notice how the reading of the text is divided into short sections with focused prompts and clear directions for how the section is to be read. A well-designed reading guide meaningfully involves all students, focuses on critical content, and helps students focus on important themes, central ideas, and key details. Notice again how the design of the lesson embeds principles of explicit instruction.
IES Practice Guide, Improving Adolescent Literacy and Effective Classroom Intervention Practices includes recommendation 4, increase student motivation and engagement in literacy learning. We can do this through self-selection of reading texts and writing prompts. To increase literacy, we must increase motivation and engagement, which typically declines as students enter middle school. Student choice in learning, such as book selection and options in writing activities, increases engagement and comprehension. Teachers who explore what matters to students and make learning activities relevant to students' lives and interests see an increase in both engagement and comprehension. In this 5th grade example, the task is read a fantasy through the lens of the guiding question and write a paragraph to respond to that guiding question. A task using a similar formula where the teacher identifies the scope of choice in reading, a reading comprehension task or lens during reading, and a writing task tied to reading can become habitual in a literacy classroom and take less time to dissect over time. It may also mean that as self-selection becomes more routine in the classroom, there may be options in the guiding question or a scope of choice in writing products as well. To explicitly teach this, I would begin by modeling a think aloud of the task. I see today's task as asking me to pick from the genre of fantasy. I know it is defined by departing from reality. I am also going to have a guiding question while I read, and I will write a paragraph about it. I think that means I'm doing a literary response. First, I will want to look at the question before I pick out a text. The question today is, what does fantasy teach us about real life? I noticed that this question asks about real life, but fantasy is different from that. So I might look for a story where there are connections or illustrations of what reality is like through the way the author creates their fantasies. After looking at my collection, I'm going to choose The Clockman by Shel Silverstein. I selected this because when I scanned the text, I could see the character dialogue is rich and discussing real and fantasy time. That's what I will look for while I read today. Next, it's your turn. Here, as the teacher, you choose how much freedom to give your students. They may be choosing between two samples from novels, or they may be able to choose any novel in the genre in your classroom, or the scope may be somewhere in between. After leading students through self-selection and reading, I would model and students would write to respond to literary texts, a standard that is now distinct in the 2020 ELA standards. In using this routine of pairing reading and writing, I bundled at least 4 standards: self-selecting and reading grade level texts, reading from various perspectives and identities like and unlike their own, writing routinely for a range of tasks, and writing to respond to a literary text. Next, let's look at another example. In this 10th grade example, students will be self-selecting paired passages to read and self-selecting guiding questions when writing to respond to literary texts. The student prompt is self-select 2 memoir excerpts to read through the lens of the guiding question, write to respond to the literary texts, comparing and contrasting excerpts in a 1-page response. Students will also choose a guiding question, either how does time or how does place shape identity in memoirs? After dissecting the text and reading aloud from the first excerpt, I would identify how Cisneros' identity is shaped by a sense of home she feels as a Latina in Chicago and a sense of homelessness she feels as a Latina when studying in Iowa. I would then read aloud from the Harjo excerpt and encourage the class to identify how place shapes her identity. In preparation for writing to respond to a literary text, I would then model and gradually release a think aloud of the similarities and differences, the role of home as a place shapes self, identifying that both Cisneros and Harjo develop identities of home, identities of self and home from the places where they were raised, and allow the class to develop ways in which place work differently in developing their senses of self. As this is a paired passage prompt, I provided 4 memoir excerpts where identity is shaped by time, place, and experience. From You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, Notes of a Native Son, The Things They Carried, and I Am Malala. As students read, I would continue to ask students how they see time and place in the narrator's experience and how that shapes their identity, encouraging them to annotate those reflections. And as they move into the second passage, annotate similarities and differences. Moving into brief routine writing that could be saved for possible later expansion into a complete essay. In using this routine of pairing self-selection of reading and writing, I bundled at least 4 standards: self-selecting and reading grade level texts, selecting and reading texts by multiple authors on the same theme to examine issues from multiple perspectives, writing routinely for a range of tasks, choosing topics, and writing to respond to a literary text.
The IES practice guides support 2 evidence-based practices that tie really well together. First, students should write regularly and for a variety of purposes. And second, that writing should be connected to other learning, particularly in grammar and reading comprehension. Thinking about 2nd graders and how we could develop lessons and instruction using the evidence-based practices of writing regularly and connecting to text, I'm providing a few do's and don'ts in our planning. Do teach the elements of writing a narrative story, for example, in second grade. Those elements would be characters, setting, and conflict, and connect that to a lesson on identifying those story elements in reading. I've put the matched reading and writing benchmarks at second grade that pair well together there. And then make sure that students know the writing they're doing is for a purpose. In this example, the purpose is to tell a story. There are two things I really want you to avoid in planning writing instruction. One is we don't want to teach reading and writing separately without connecting the two. And we don't want to give writing prompts without giving writing instruction and helping students develop their writing skills. Okay, let's look at a second grade example. If we were going to really focus on the literary element of conflict and have writing assignments about conflict over several days, we would want to make sure we give students choice in which of those writing assignments they want to develop into a more developed story. And I would suggest reading from mentor texts to show how authors introduce conflict. The mentor text I picked that I would use in a second grade lesson is Jojo McCoon's The Used to Be Best Friend by Don Quigley. One thing that's really fun about this book is that the author describes the conflict in the first 2 pages. Jojo needs friends because her cat doesn't know how to speak to her, and her best friend doesn't want to be her friend anymore. 2 prompts that could be based on how this author describes a conflict would be to ask the students, when did they experience a conflict with a friend? And let them know this is part of writing to tell a story. And then after reading the book, we might say, yesterday we read how an author put a conflict right at the start of a story. Let's write at least 2 sentences that introduce a conflict that will start 2 stories. This is another skill in writing to tell a story. Now let's look at this from a 7th grade lesson. We do want to teach the elements of writing. In this example, I'm going to use writing to argue. And we want to make sure that this is connected to a lesson on identifying author's argument in reading. So again, these are good paired or bundled benchmarks at the 7th grade level that we can accomplish through this lesson. And the purpose for this writing is to argue. The avoid box is a review from the 2nd grade lesson. So we'll look at an example lesson for 7th grade where we could have students do several writing assignments over several days about argument. We could give students choice in which parts of those writing assignments they might incorporate into a more developed argument. And again, we could read from mentor texts to show how authors state and support their arguments. A book that I looked at for this was Voces Sin Fronteras, which is a book put out by the Latin American Youth Center. I read 2 essays in this, and the page numbers are there on the slide. In those essays, both Alejandro and Lisa are making arguments that could be categorized as facts of life arguments. Alejandro's argument is that a person's past does not define his future. And Lisa is arguing that nothing in life is easy, but perseverance is important. The first prompt on the slide provides students with the argument and asks them to write about how the author supports that argument. And then the third prompt asks students both to identify an argument, and then in the 4th prompt, how they would develop their own facts of life argument.
Thank you for watching this webinar. Please feel free to send any questions directly to me at the email address on the screen. Also, keep an eye out for additional webinars in the 2020 ELA Standards Implementation Support Series, as well as notice of additional implementation support from the Minnesota Service Cooperatives. The PowerPoint slides used in this presentation are available on the MDE ELA implementation page.